Hi, everybody. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Wednesday, February 5th, and today I'm going to talk about Venus's upcoming entrance into the sign of Aries. And this is another one of the major transits of the month. You might have heard me talking yesterday about Mercury's entrance into Pisces, and that's a pretty significant one because Mercury will be in Pisces now pretty much until the middle of April through its retrograde. Little dip into Aquarius, but another one of the major planetary ingresses of the month happens when Venus enters Aries, which is happening in just about 2 days from now. So the reason that this is really significant is because we also have a major dignity change with Venus moving from the sign of its exaltation in Pisces into the sign of its detriment or exile in Aries. So that's what we're going to talk about today, what to watch for, how to prepare for it, and a little advice on how to track transits in general. I get questions a lot from people asking how to prioritize their interpretations of what's happening in the sky, especially given that so many different things are happening. There's never a one answer fits all response to questions about what to prioritize or what to watch for first, but hopefully in the way that I demonstrate the ingress of Venus into Aries today, you'll also just pick up some of the people who've been asking questions about how to prioritize. You'll pick up some tips from what I'm about to show you. So, all right, let me put the real-time clock up on the screen so you can see it. And let's take a look at what's going on right now. You can see Venus is in the late degrees of Pisces, where it is exalted. And if we move this forward just a little bit, going into the 7th, you're going to see on this Friday that Venus is going to change signs. Right there, you can see Venus changing signs into Aries about mid-afternoon on Friday. That's Eastern Time, United States. So that is when Venus enters Aries. Now, puts it about 2 days away from right now. Now, when we look at how long it's going to take Venus to go through Aries, you're going to see Venus in Aries from the 7th all the way to about March 5th. So about a month, you could say roughly, that Venus will spend in the sign of Aries. So there's not just one thing that we can say about Venus being in Aries. It means a lot of different things. Let's start off by giving you some tips for how to track planetary transits in general, and I'll just apply it to this Venus in Aries situation that we're about to experience. So for starters, Venus will enter the sign of Aries, like we said on Friday. So let's move it forward a little bit. And you'll see that dignity change take place, which means Venus goes from being exalted to being in its exile or detriment. Now, the reason for this is that anytime that you take a planet and you put it in the sign opposite to its own domicile, it's said to be in its detriment or its exile. And the reason for that is that you're putting it into the temple whose planetary ruler is naturally opposite to itself. So Venus is always opposite the signs of Mars. Venus in Libra and Taurus, put them in Aries or Scorpio, put Venus in Aries or Scorpio, and you have Venus in Mars's temple. Venus and Mars are planetary contraries in the language of Hellenistic astrology. So ancient Western astrology, we see Mars and Venus as sort of like polar opposites. For obvious reasons, most of us don't need to hear this, but for example, Venus is harmony, peace, love, sensuality. Mars is competition, anger, violence, divisiveness, etc. So, and there's light and dark sides to both Mars and Venus. It's not like one of them is a good guy and one of them is a bad guy per se. But when a planet enters the sign of its exile, it is as though Venus will want to do normal Venusian things, like Venus seeks out romance and beauty and the satisfaction of the senses and clean, beautiful environments. In Indian astrology, Venus is considered a sattvic planet, which means it sort of resonates with the mode of goodness and sort of clean and even sort of pious or holy. Venus was related in Western astrology, for example, to the cleanliness of temples. So this planet has a range of meanings, and the idea is that when it enters the sign of Aries, it simply becomes a little bit difficult for Mars to satisfy or appease the needs of his house guest. Venus is the house guest, and Mars is delivering things like what Venus wants. Say Venus wants a clean temple, a sattvic, clean, pure, beautiful environment, or Venus wants romance and sensuality and love, and Mars is going to give things like a knife, you know what I mean, or a butcher's knife, a scalpel. Mars is going to give things like conflict and will and individual battles of will. Venus likes to harmonize things. So it's a difficult place for Venus just simply based on the clashing of Mars and Venus. But then we have this secondary layer of interpretation, which is always very important, and that is to ask the question, where is Mars? Because it's not, this is a living picture. The planets are always moving, and their dynamics with one another are not so static. It's not that Venus in Aries is always just totally bad. It has a lot to do with Venus in Aries connecting with Mars. Where is Mars? So what we're seeing is that Mars is going to be in the sign of Sagittarius. It's been there for a while. And when Mars is in the sign of Sagittarius, you can follow the dignity chain out a little bit. It's also, Mars is not in its home sign. It's in Jupiter's sign. And Jupiter, of course, is in its fall in Saturn's sign. So right now, the planet you could say in the sky that has the most essential dignity is going to be Saturn in the traditional scheme. So ultimately, we're looking, you could say, if I don't encourage people to go down the rabbit hole too much with too many connections. Sometimes your mind gets flooded. But when you look at this picture, what you're seeing Venus being served by Mars, who is in turn being served by a fallen Jupiter, who is house guest of a very empowered Saturn. So when you play that out and then kind of try to take some interpretations away from that, what do you get? Well, when you have Mars in Jupiter's sign and Jupiter is in its fall with Saturn having a lot of power, you have the potential for relationships to become tainted. Let's say Venus rules relationships, to be tainted by the aggressive, puritanical, moral, or incredibly conservative agenda of Jupiter in its fall and Saturn's sign, which is to say, there could be conflict in relationships around ideologies, beliefs, differing political or moral or spiritual or theological or philosophical points of view. And it could be, for example, that it's difficult to harmonize these kinds of differences in the weeks to come, that that there's an intensity that starts developing around these things. We can already see it coming right now with, for example, you can already see it coming with some of the political hostility that's amping up right now with the State of the Union address, and Nancy Pelosi ripped up the speech from President Trump, and he wouldn't shake her hand, and these are, obviously these are just really small, kind of absurd moments to use as illustrations, but you'll see probably in the coming weeks that there's a little bit more tension and more of an edginess. Now, eventually, later in the month, I think it's around the, I want to say it's like the 16th or something like that. Let me just take a look. Mars will eventually enter the sign of Capricorn, and that's going to happen, I guess, right around the 16th, 15th or 16th, looks like. Yeah, 16th. So about mid-month, Mars will become exalted and then have its own dignity, and you may see a little bit less of the edginess in relationships, as Mars picking up dignity is and not being ruled by a fallen Jupiter, so to speak, is going to be a good thing. But between, say, Friday and the middle of the month, you may find that people are just a little bit more preachy and zealous, and that it's you may find that you're unintentionally sort of pushing your agenda on people more than you should be, or that people are doing that to you. So I want to just say that's specific to what's happening with Venus right now. Let's go back to the screen so that I can just spell it out one more time. So this is because what we're looking at is very specific to the dignity chain. It's Venus in Aries, right? And then, whoops, let's go backward just a day so I can have the appropriate, here we go. There we go. So here's Venus in Aries. Now remember that as soon as Venus enters Aries, up till about the 16th, its host is Mars in Sagittarius. On one level, they do have a whole sign trine with one another, which isn't bad. They're just departing from a square with each other. When Venus was in Pisces, of course, they just moved through a square. As soon as Venus enters Aries, they're now in a whole sign trine. So they could be cooperating a little bit more, but given the underlying dignity of Mars's host, Jupiter, who is in its fall and in turn ruled by Saturn in Capricorn, you just have to remember that, the potential for there to be, what does Jupiter represent? Teachers, teachings, political and moral perspectives, the law, a sense of greater moral order in the universe, the way that your beliefs shape reality, some sense of uh, teachers, education, and maybe religious authority, among other things. But when you see Venus and Mars, Venus is debilitated, so struggling with Mars things, and then Mars looks like it could be a more zealous and dogmatic and conservative kind of Mars, or that you could be dealing with people who are sort of fanatical in some way, or somewhat unyielding and uncompromising. That you want to be careful about that, because then what you're getting the feeling of is the potential to manipulate or be manipulated by people who are maybe trying to strike up some kind of deal or bargain or work with you, or get you on their team or something like that, but their underlying agenda is either really aggressive or potentially very kind of conservative and controlling or something like that. So again, these are just impressions that you can pick up, and there's others, but that gives you a sense of how to follow the dignity chain. And ancient astrologers paid a lot of attention to the moment that a planet ingressed, meaning that when a planet enters a new sign, you pay a lot of attention to it because it's entering a new sign, but it's also entering a new whole sign house. Ancient astrologers, of course, used whole sign houses. So any ingress changes the entire dignity scheme of how everything is relating to everything else, which is why I said about the middle of the month, when Venus is in Mars sign and then Mars moves into its exaltation and is no longer dependent upon a fallen Jupiter as it is now in Sagittarius, you'll see a totally different kind of dynamic coming forward, one that's probably more productive and less prone to the, let's just say, the kind of conservative agenda that Jupiter might have right now, that will probably overly conservative. Sometimes conservative doesn't have to mean political either. It can just mean conserving resources, conserving time, tightening up boundaries, etc. So, but whereas that agenda might be a little stern and intense right now, and you may feel that tension in relationships, things will probably become more productive in the middle of the month when Mars moves into its exaltation in Capricorn. We'll talk about that later in the month and kind of refresh on how that shift might take place and what you could expect from it. But the other couple of things to watch for with Venus moving into Aries are going to be, any way in which, Venus naturally can serve as a kind of indicator as to where our our subtle desires are steering us, how they are steering us. every day we wake up and we might think about something simple like, oh, today I want to go have this food, or I'm kind of hungry for this, or I want this, or I desire that, or I'm excited to do this. And most of it is geared around, pleasure. Sometimes we have a lot of things to do, duties to perform, things that we feel responsible for. Usually somewhere in us, there's some guiding beacon taking us to the next treat, So you can always watch Venus's movements in a sense to get a feeling as to where your treat body, where it's taking you. And uh, when it's in Mars's sign, you just have to be careful that it's not taking you into conflict, which sounds weird, but it's like, for example, having a natural desire for, blood, conflict, violence, hostility, drama, intensity, anything that, just is a little bit more Mars-like. You have to be careful of that because you might naturally follow that instinct or impulse, but it could be, if you're someone who's very sensitive, sometimes the impulses that we have, in other words, to follow whatever Venus is doing, won't actually make us feel good. So you have to really check in with yourself and notice if you're being drawn into anything that's more martial or combative or aggressive, whether that's actually going to make you happy or not. And it could. I'm not saying it couldn't, but it's worth checking in, because often enough, Venus in Mars's sign will be like, could I have something beautiful? And Mars will be like, here's a bloody piece of meat, like. So so you just have to be careful about, looking carefully at your values and noting that Mars might be guiding the ship a little bit more. There could be some complex interaction between Venus and Mars when it comes to the pursuit of pleasure right now. Sometimes you have to be careful too, like getting excited by things, feeling engaged and drawn in by things, which Venus likes to do, kind of will lure us in through some atmosphere that somehow is attractive to us. When Venus is in Mars sign, sometimes that environment is conflict. For example, I'm going to get in some big debate, or I'm going to get in some fight with somebody, or I'm feeling like I want to call somebody out or something. Like being drawn into conflict, like moth to the fire. Be careful of that as well. The other thing, of course, is going to be potential and helpful would be things around women and women in power, women's sisters, and conflict around women sisters or friends or friendship, and there being some degree of um, you know testing each other's wills, or differing ideas or beliefs in relationships, like I said, especially while Mars is still in Jupiter sign till about the 16th. So you can watch for those potential conflicts and try to navigate around them unless something really needs to be said or addressed, at which point the maybe the question to ask, which I think is always helpful, is is this is this absolutely necessary when it comes to expressing conflict and anger with one another? Is this absolutely necessary? Is it really, do I really need to do this? And then how can I do it in a way that is constructive and kind and loving? And asking those questions while Venus is in Aries, if there is something that needs to be confronted or approached, will help us to keep the environment sattvic, which is to say, keep it clean, keep it beautiful, keep it harmonizing. There's nothing that really distracts or takes us off from our spiritual focus in life, or with our spiritual practices, let's say, more than sabotaging the flow that we create with our practices with really intense combative energy, hostility and conflict, or when that kind of information comes into us from the news. There's so much violence on the news. Just protecting our environment, safeguarding it from too much of the conflict and sort of intensity that Mars can bring. And again, I think this shifts probably later in the month as Mars picks up dignity, and we'll come around to that later. Um, of course, one other thing that can kind of come up to be aware of is going to be the like it's very easy for there to be the need to create something clean around us, right? That this is this idea of Venus being about cleanliness and harmonizing the environment. It's also just part of the deal that when Venus comes into Aries, that there is sometimes more inter, periods of interruption or invasiveness, like the feeling of just trying to create a kind of tranquil, serene environment can be sort of punctuated by like rude interruptions or misfortune or accidents or bills or health or conflicts in relationships. Just in general, Mars was a planet that brought strife, and Venus is a planet that likes peace. And so, peace and strife, in some ways, in this world of duality, are two sides of the same coin. And we learn and grow spiritually, of course. God's an equal opportunity employer when it comes to allowing us to be employed in serving the divine. And so, we can learn, grow, and serve the divine in all seasons, whether there's conflict or peace. So it's not really to privilege one or the other. However, we know that part of what we're trying to create is an inner sanctuary in our hearts. And part of the way that we do that is how we respond to the kinds of stimuli that come in and seem really invasive or unfortunate or difficult. If we allow ourselves to be thrown off and we kind of go, well, screw it, I was doing good, but now look at what happened, and clearly I can't stay on the horse anymore. Clearly, like, it was pointless to even try, or we, like that, we allow ourselves to be frustrated. Then we're not really choosing to learn from the presence of that strife that naturally comes in. The Venus and Aries periods of time are always periods to kind of fine tune our ability to uh, sustain peace and a serene environment despite whatever may be thrown at us. And that's easier said than done, but that's just part of the natural meaning of, when Venus moves into Mars's signs. This is why it's also not necessarily the greatest time to try to maintain too much externally, or to change or shift things externally for the sake of, making something more beautiful or more peaceful or whatever, because it's a time where you're going to be prone to things kind of coming in and messing with your attempt to do that. This is why many astrologers will tell you you shouldn't necessarily go and get plastic surgery or get a new tattoo or buy expensive new artwork or try to redesign something in your home, or whatever, because the potential, if it's done during this energy, is for there to be some element of misfortune or strife to come in and mess with it. So, for example, I shared this personal story, I think a few videos ago. During a Venus in Aries, we one time decided to get new carpet for the house. And we just have one room. It's like our family room. And so we were like, okay, we're going to get a new carpet in this family room. And the carpet, it was a kind of thing where it was rushed, and there was a lot of pressure, and then the workers came in and did a really poor job, and we continually have to get the carpet restretched because of the original poor job that they did. And the reason that they did a poor job, who knows, but we really knew this was not the company to hire. But we did it because we were in a rush and we wanted something to look nice, and we wanted the environment to feel better, and we wanted it now, right? So that's the thing that you have to be a little bit careful about. Is there's a big difference between the temple inside and the natural desire that we have to make the life around us peaceful as well. Sometimes when Venus is in Aries, you'll just notice that the more you try to create peace in the external, the more that elements of discord or strife will come in to just test you. So knowing that, just be flexible and take it as a period of time where you're becoming that equal opportunity employer for your own spiritual life. You're like, you know what? I'll take it. If this stress or this, bother or whatever is right now teaching me to let go, accept, and be present at a much deeper level, then cool, why not just roll with it? So, that's my advice for everybody. The other thing, of course, is that just to be a little end on a positive note today, Venus in the sign of Aries can also be very much about the empowerment of women, and anything that is feminine or goddess oriented, and the controversy that comes with that. So, um, you know, there's obviously there's I'm not going to be I don't want to pretend to be an expert on the subject, but what I will say is that as a father of two girls, um, I think it's important with during Venus and Aries periods to just notice around you and notice in the world at large the way that topics related to more feminine qualities or virtues are being addressed or handled. Um, and notice some of the double standards and things like that. Um, for example, if we look at the I Ching, or if we look at, well, I'll just talk about the I Ching for starters. The interplay between yin and yang, which is a sort of standard masculine and feminine. Um, there is a way in which both can be dominant, both can be leaders, both can be submissive to the other in certain ways. In Bhakti Yoga, for example, we say that the source that we all come from is sort of the quintessential masculine, and that absolutely everything else is the quintessential feminine. Um, and so in that paradigm, in that picture, and it's not really male female isn't really the way to think about it. It's more like uh, active and receptive, and the way that when the receptive comes into service of the active, that the active also submits in some ways and surrenders itself, becomes a servant of the receptive, and back and forth and back and forth. And so ultimately, Venus and Mars are also about the dance of reciprocation. And what we can all learn from Venus and Aries is how to be appropriately submissive. And the way that by being intelligent in the way that we are humble or submissive or receptive to others around us, whether they're men or women or anything, we will find that we often have more control in the situation. We're granted or we're given more dignity. We're granted or we're given more responsibility or more power. Um, for example, let's just say you're working for someone, and let's say they're not a bad boss. Let's say they're like a decent human being, okay? Not all of us have that, but let's say like they're a decent human being. In the ideal sense, they might be in charge, they might be the one directing the show. And we find that if we're working for someone and our values align with that person, but we're new, we're maybe lower on the totem pole, so to speak, in the pecking order of the company. If we do good work and this person is an actual virtuous boss, ideally they would say, oh, look, this person has done so well being of service to the higher cause of our company. And because of that, um, the boss becomes less and less of a boss and you're an employee. And even though certain kinds of power or functional distinctions may continue to exist, the relationship starts moving into a more of a peer level sometimes. And also eventually sometimes the boss becomes submissive to the employee. The boss says, you have such good ideas, why don't you take the reins on this? And then we do, right? Now I'm talking obviously in an ideal world, in an ideal work environment with a boss who's actually like, not a power hungry, whatever, jerk. But whether it's a man or a woman, any kind of exchange, the idea of Venus and Aries is also that we can learn in the world, that if we learn how to be in the right environments with the right people, if we learn how to be humble and receptive, right? Not being walked all over. There's a difference, and sometimes we have to distinguish for ourselves that difference between Venus and Aries, but not letting ourselves be walked all over, but learning how to be strong in the role, in a humble role, in a service role? How do we be strong, willing, capable, not losing our sense of choice, dignity, or integrity, but in a sense submitting or humbling ourselves to the will of something else, not even necessarily a person, just maybe the way things are flowing, and we just say, okay, I'm not going to get steamrolled by this. That's not what surrender means, but I'm going to go along with this. When we do that, it's weird how the universe seems to naturally start giving us more opportunities for the expression of our individual creative nature, will, choices, even leadership, etc. It's a paradox that sometimes becoming stronger in ourselves and learning how to exercise our will in more powerful ways comes from knowing how to be humble and receptive and of service. And that is something that that Venus and Aries dynamic can um, really help us to locate within ourselves, how to be strong while being receptive, how to be submissive to the flow of energy, knowing that I'm not the author of all things, right? And then when we do so without losing ourselves, we find that we're being used by it and even empowered by it. And that, can you imagine? People a lot of times nowadays like to talk about what the world might look like if women were leading. But according to, you know, again, if you look at the Tao Te Ching or the I Ching, that is what it looks like when the yin leads. When we learn how to be receptive to the energies flowing around us, but we don't lose ourselves, we become humble, unassuming servants, we're then empowered by it. And that's the interaction between heaven and earth, between yin and yang. So ultimately, I try to be really careful when Venus is in the sign of Aries, that I'm not trying to exert my will too intensely if the people or situation around me doesn't feel conducive to it. But it's weird how when I listen to that, I'm like right now, that naturally what happens is the world around me starts to then it naturally, like my thoughts or my opinions or my feelings or where I may want things to go naturally gets employed in the flow of time and events. So that's my take on Venus and Aries. My wife was born with Venus and Aries, and she was in she has it in her career house. I'll just share a story from her since I know she'd be happy to share it. She was in a position so many times in her career where she was basically in a helping role for people like strong women, studio owners, yoga studio owners who and herbalists, and worked at a herbal like a college for herbalism and acupuncture, and in those roles, because she was so willing to be helpful and harmonizing. She had an agenda, but she recognized that anytime she tried to push it, it didn't really work. So she kind of joined the team, and eventually she was empowered by those choices. And I, I, we've talked a lot about how there's always the push pull when Venus is in Aries, though, where there may be patterns that you also have to look at that can go in the opposite direction, where sometimes you tend to defer, and then you get walked on and nobody really empowers you. And if that's happening, it really should be uh, a message that you're not in the right situation. So sometimes Venus in Aries is also about moving out of a situation where you've tried your best to be in service and harmonize with those around you, but you get trampled or you get walked on, and then you might need to make an exit and find a situation where your natural desire to harmonize your will with something larger will find a place of reciprocation, because the universe wants to reciprocate with us. It's not a power structure where there's the universe wants to be on top of the individual soul and just looking down on it. We want to be harmonizing and co-creating. So at any rate, those are some rambling thoughts. I hope that this was interesting and useful for you all today. I apologize, I'm not in my normal environment, so the audio is not the greatest, and I know it looks kind of weird, but I'm gone, I'm out of town this week, so um, yeah, so thanks for hanging with me. And tell me your comments in the comment section. What is Venus and Aries like for you? Tell me your stories. How have you related with Venus and Aries? How are you experiencing it? If you listen to this in the next couple of days, or even return to it next week, how has this transit been treating you already? And any other insights that you guys like to share would be great to hear from. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.